again my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Teutsch, who will be speaking about soil fertility today. Dr. Chris Teutsch grew up on a small crop and livestock farm in northeastern Virginia. After 4 years of military service, he was selected to represent during his year in Germany, he attended the German school and worked on dairy farms. His master's research evaluated the impact of banded phosphorus application on the ability of seedling alfalfa to withstand flooding stress. After completing his Master's of Science degree in 1996, he was awarded a graduate research assistantship at the University of Kentucky, where he completed a doctorate of philosophy in forage management and physiology. His dissertation project evaluated stocking rates of cows and calves for reclaimed mineland pastures located in the Appalachian region of the United States. In 2000, Dr. Teutsch was hired as an assistant professor at Virginia Tech's Southern Piedmont Agricultural Research and Extension Center, located out of Blacksburg, Virginia. In this capacity, he has developed a nationally known forage research and extension program. These programs have focused on increasing the profitability of ruminant livestock operations in Virginia by reducing the amount of conserve forage used during the summer and winter months. Dr. Teutsch was promoted to associate professor and tenured in the Crop and Soil Environmental Sciences Department at Virginia Tech in 2006. In 2009, Dr. Teutsch received the Harlan White Distinguished Service Award from the Virginia Forage and Grassland Council, its highest award, in recognition of his outstanding leadership and dedicated service to Virginia's forage and livestock industry. In 2011, he received the Virginia Agribusiness Council's Outstanding Extension Service Award for his contribution to Virginia's forage and livestock industry. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Teutsch.
Pleased to wear.
Thank you so much. Can you hear all right in the back? Thank you so much for that very nice introduction. And these have been the best introductions I've ever had at any conference, and some of the longest too. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to spend just a little bit of time visiting with you about soil fertility and grazing systems this morning. I think we all are painfully aware of what petroleum prices have done in the last few years and what fertilizer prices have done. And I think we really need to take a look at our grazing systems and think about how we can build and maintain soil fertility within those grazing systems in a cost-effective manner. And that's kind of what my talk is about today. Here's just the fertilizer prices graphed out, and that's N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for the last 20 years. And everything was pretty steady Eddie until we got along to around 2005, and then things started to creep up. And in 2006, things really went haywire, and we saw huge increases in fertilizer price. And they've come down a little bit since, but they're still at all-time high. And I don't see any real relief except maybe possibly in nitrogen coming in the near future. And this last price was from Crop Production Services, which is located in the south side of Virginia, and that was in mid-September of 2012. So right now we're looking at prices for nutrients in that range of 60 to 70 cents a pound of nutrient. When I came to Virginia, those prices were down around 20 cents per pound of nutrient. So we've seen some dramatic increases in fertilizer price. And fertilizer price, of course, is not the only thing that's increased. This is a diesel fuel price. And we've seen dramatic increases in both gasoline and diesel fuel prices. So what that means for us as agricultural producers is that anything that moves is going to cost more. And everything we get, all of our inputs have to get to us somehow, and it's going to cost more because of higher energy prices to ship that material. I guess this is kind of the bright spot on the horizon is the natural gas production in the Northeast. In fact, my dad's farm is located right in Northeast Ohio, just across the border from Northwest Pennsylvania, right in the natural gas boom area where they're doing a lot of hydraulic fracking. And that's really brought the cost of natural gas down. And that's important for us as producers because we use natural gas on nitrogen fertilizer. And we have some new nitrogen fertilizer plants coming online in the United States, which hopefully will bring our nitrogen fertilizer price a little bit in the United States. Low nitrogen fertilizer prices have really acted kind of as a crutch for us as producers in terms of managing legumes within our pastures. It's often a lot easier, rather than managing for legumes, to really use nitrogen fertilizer. And that was okay when it was 20 or 25 cents a pound. But now that it's 70 cents a pound, we've really got to think how we manage those legumes and manage our nitrogen cycles within grazing systems. And I did want to mention that fossil fuel doesn't come completely free for us. There is an environment of extracting fossil fuel from the ground, and we always need to keep that in mind and do as good of a job as we can as limiting the environmental impact. This is the feeder calf prices in Virginia over the last 10 years or so, and we can see the 10-year average price is right there with the dotted line, and we're above that average price, so that's good news. The bad news is all of our input costs are much above the average price for the last 10 years too. So even though we still have good price, the cost of production have gone up significantly. Whenever I talk about soil fertility, I just like to start with von Liebig's law of the minimum. And all this law says is that the level of production can be no greater than that allowed by the most limiting of essential plant growth factors. And there's lots of different essential plant growth factors. There's nutrients like potassium and nitrogen and phosphorus, and there's soil acidity that can limit plant growth. Temperature can limit cool season grass growth. Our climate is increasing in temperature, and that could very well cause a shift in what we find in our pastures as we move north in the United States. Moisture is a big factor limiting pasture production. And sometimes it's hard to get your mind around what this is saying, so I've got a little demonstration for you. Hopefully it'll keep you awake. This is a terrible time to have a talk right after lunch. But let's see here. So if we think of this vessel when it's completely full as 100% yield, so when we fill this up, and on each side of this vessel, we've got nitrogen, we've got soil pH, we've got potassium, we've got phosphorus. These are all plant growth factors. In reality, there's many more plant growth factors than this. But the point I want to make is that when this is full, we're at 100% yield. Now, say we are in a situation where we've been cutting hay off of a hayfield for a number of years now, and potassium price has been pretty high, so we've kind of been skimping a little bit on it.
About what are our goals, our objectives, our targets?
Or maybe we're at the low level. So watch what happens when I try to fill this up. Remember, when it's completely full, that's when we're at 100% yield. I've got to do this without making too big of a mess. So we're going along pretty good. And our yield potential's coming right up. What in the world's in there?
Actually, that was off, and that got me.
That's exactly right, and that's exactly what von Liebig's law said. Whatever's the most limiting essential plant growth factor, in this case potassium, we can dump as much nitrogen, and we can dump as much phosphorus, and we can dump as much lime, and even water onto that pasture. But if that single growth factor is limiting overall production. So we have to identify what's limiting our overall production. In this case, it's potassium. Until we plug that hole, we're never going to be able to achieve maximum yield.
Next.
So now that we've identified our essential plant growth factor that's missing. We can optimize. This is a simple demonstration, but I think it drives an important point home. And that point is that when we talk about soil fertility, we can't pick and choose what nutrients we want to apply. That's not really an option. We've got to have a balanced approach to soil fertility. We've got to identify the nutrients that are limiting overall production and then supply those nutrients in adequate amounts to optimize our production in our pastures and hayfields. Okay, thank you. And this is just another picture of von Liebig's barrel. And we can kind of think of those staves. And the lower the stave, the more water it's going to let out, and we can fill that barrel up past that lowest stave. So let's talk a little bit about soil testing pastures. And I know you've heard this 1,000 times, and you're going to hear it one more time from me. But soil testing is really an important part of a soil fertility program. Otherwise, we're just guessing. And I sat beside somebody last night at dinner, and you know, he says, well, I'm just going to apply 13, 13, 13. And, well, you know, it's your money. You can do that if you want to. But when you apply a complete fertilizer like that blind, you have no idea whether you're supplying enough of each of those nutrients or not enough of those nutrients. So it provides us a baseline to base our whole fertility program on. And people often say, well, fertilizer price is so high, I'm not even going to bother soil testing. This is probably the most important time that you can soil test because it really allows you to develop a targeted application program for your pastures. So you can figure out what your most limiting essential plant growth factors are and fill those gaps so that you can optimize production and really develop a targeted fertilization program for your pastures. 2 to 4 inch soil depth for pastures. Avoid atypical areas. This is very important. If you've got an area or a paddock that you're feeding hay on, a sample from where you're feeding a lot of hay. You don't want to sample from around a water or around a shade area. Wherever animals congregate, you want to avoid those areas so that doesn't give you a false reading for your soil fertility. And then keep track of your soil fertility. You're much better off to go and sample every 2 or 3 years and keep a running tally of the soil fertility levels in your pastures and make small adjustments as you go along rather than letting things really get out of whack in soil sampling every 10 years or so. And again, in Virginia, in West Virginia, soil tests don't cost anything to send into the state lab. So the way that we kind of make recommendations with our soil test levels is that we have 4 different ranges, very low, low, medium, high, and then we graph those against relative yield response. And what we see is when we're in these low and very low, we get a very big increase from adding fertilizer to our pastures. As we get into this medium range, that response rate tails off, and by the time we reach that medium plus high minus range, we don't expect to get a yield increase anymore from applying additional fertilizer. And that's kind of how we make our recommendations. This is the ideal place to be, right? You know, teetering on that medium plus high minus range where we're supplying our plants' needs but not over applying fertilizer. You know, in today's reality, if we can kind of keep us in that medium plus range, we're going to be doing pretty good. Because we limit yield a little bit towards the bottom of the medium range, but we don't get that tremendous yield response that we would get when we're down in that very low and low range. Soil acidity is a major factor that limits pasture production in the southeastern United States. And it's got multiple impacts on our pastures. The first thing it does is it reduces nutrient availability within our pastures. So even though we may have certain nutrients in our soils, their availability to the plant is lowered when we have acidity in our soils. It also reduces nitrogen fixation in our legumes. As we move forward, the legumes are going to be a very, very important part of pasture systems, and they're going to bring nitrogen into those pasture systems. So we've got to limit the impact of soil acidity on those legumes by adjusting the pH in our pastures. Liming neutralizes that soil acidity and also applies calcium and magnesium to our pastures. These are some general guidelines, but for for a grass clover mixture, we want to be in that range of 6 to 6.4. It is going to create a good environment to encourage that clover in that stand. This is a graph of nutrient availability and how it's affected by pH, or soil acidity. When we look here, we have a pH of 4, which is very acid, and we have a pH of 10, which is very alkaline. And each one of these bands represents a different nutrient. We've got nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium. The wider the band, the more plant available these nutrients are in the soil. So when we look at this optimum pH for pastures, this 6 to 7.0 range, and 7.0 is a neutral pH, that's when our bands are the widest for our major macronutrients that we need in our plants. So just by adding lime to our pastures, we can increase nutrient availability in our soils. The reason I'm showing you this is that if you do a soil test and you need lime, lime is probably your best buy of all the fertility products that you can get. Because when
We'll talk
lime,
about that. It's these trade-offs with animal performance.
nutrient are more available to that plant. So let's talk a little bit about legumes and grazing systems. And I know this is a little bit of a review for most of you, but legumes form a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria. And they find on the roots of the plant, little pink structures. And the rhizobium bacteria live in those nodules. So in this symbiotic relationship with the legume plant, the rhizobium bacteria get a place to live, and they also get an energy source from that plant in the form of sugars. And in return, those bacteria fix nitrogen and supply nitrogen to that legume plant that it can use for growth of that plant. Adding legumes to pastures are going to increase yields. They're going to increase forage quality and animal performance. They're going to improve summer growth,
Here today.
especially if we choose deep-rooted, tap-rooted legumes like alfalfa. And also Sericea Lespedeza has a very aggressive tap root. And they can find water very deep in the soil and improve summer growth. Probably most important for us in the fescue belt of the country is that adding legumes is going to dilute the endophyte in tall fescue. And that's one of the management strategies that we use to reduce the toxicity of Kentucky 31 tall fescue, which probably most of us in this room have in our pastures in some portion. And this is just a table that shows you the value of nitrogen fixed by different legumes. If we look at alfalfa, alfalfa is our most aggressive nitrogen fixer, 150 to 250 pounds. And if we look at nitrogen cost, which is around 70 cents now, we're looking at a value somewhere between $125 and $150 per acre, depending on the value we put on that nitrogen. As we go down the list, red clover and ladino clover fix less nitrogen than alfalfa. And then we get into our Lespedeza, annual Lespedeza, which fixes the least amount of nitrogen. Now, one thing that we do when we show you a table like this is we take
Of soil surface. Okay?
same thing as throwing great bag of nitrogen fertilizer. It doesn't actually work quite like it. Nitrogen is really shared indirectly for the most part between the grass and the legume plant. And when I mean indirectly, the link is the animal between there. So the animal eats that legume plant, that clover plant or that alfalfa plant in your pasture, goes through its digestive tract and comes out as dung and urine. And we start this nitrogen cycle within our pastures. So, and it's also shared indirectly through death and decomposition of plant parts. So when leaves from that
Based on,
break down the soil surface,
that's what forage allowances.
nitrogen into the system, and the grasses can use that. Also, when roots break down and they're constantly growing and regenerating and nodules break down on the roots of legume plants, that releases nitrogen into the system. So most of the sharing between a grass plant and a legume plant is indirect. There's a little evidence for direct nitrogen transfer, but it's not a great amount. So when we go forward and we're thinking about fertility in pastures, we really need to think about how we should be managing for these legumes and pastures. How do we create that environment that they're going to be productive part of the grazing system? We'd like them to make up 20 to 30% of the stand. And at that level, that means we don't really need to supply commercial nitrogen to those pastures. And that should be everyone's goal in here. Dr. Blazer at Virginia Tech, who's passed away, used to say that we should be managing pastures not for grasses, but for legumes. That's how important they are as part of a grazing system. And I think that's more true than it has ever been. So liming and fertilizing according to soil tests, that's an important step. We're creating an environment for these improved legumes that they're going to be able to thrive within. So we don't want to limit them
when we got
by our fertility applications. Overseed legumes in late winter, 4 to 6 pounds of red clover, 1 to 2 pounds of white clover. And sometimes you can put in 10 pounds of annual Lespedeza. And that costs somewhere between $20 and $30 an acre to apply. And then rotationally stocked pastures. And we talked about this in my last talk, but how we manage that sward, we can shift the composition of that sward from grasses to legumes, just by how we manage it. So if we had a tall fescue pasture and our grass was dominating that pasture, how could we switch it towards the legume in that pasture? Any ideas? Graze it close, especially for white clover. White clover tends to that close grazing height and does well underneath that. I've got a good friend and a neighbor back home in Virginia who's an excellent grass manager. Does a good job rotationally stocking his pastures. His weakness is he doesn't
how much they're likely
pastures close. In
just based on routine measures with pasture sticks.
Maintain legumes within that grazing system. His fertility's good.
Okay,
So grass growth is good, but his legume
come up with a list of
because he's letting that grass be the dominant species in that sward. So how we manage pastures can impact what species are present in those pastures. I'd like to talk a little bit about nutrient cycling and cow-calf systems. And when we look at a cow-calf system, we have inputs coming into that system, and they come in different forms. Fertilizer, manure, legumes are bringing nitrogen into the system. Any concentrate or creep feed that we may give those animals are all bringing nutrients into this grazing system. And then these nutrients are cycled around this grazing system. It's important to remember that about 90% of what goes in the front end of the animal comes out the back end in terms of nutrients. And it's up to us to manage that nutrient cycle within those pastures. And then we look at our exports from a cow-calf system. So really what we're exporting is this calf. John Laurie at the University of Missouri did an analysis where he looked at nutrient removal from a calf pair. One cow-calf removes about 10 pounds, 7 pounds of P2O5 and almost 1 pound of K2O. So think about that for just a second. Say we're stocked at between 2 and 3, just say 3 acres for the sake of argument, per cow-calf unit. So we're removing about 2 or 2.5 pounds of P2O5 per acre per year with that calf. It's not a lot. What can happen in pastures is that we can redistribute those nutrients through poor grazing management. We'll talk about that in the next slide. So say we have this big boundary, maybe it's 40 or 50 acres. In the animals, what happens in a continuous grazing system? Well, the animals go out here and they graze around a little bit, and then they come back to where they go back to.
The pastures, but by the same token.
Water, that's right. And they in the water and they lay around and they ruminate life. And then they get back up to go out. And what happens when they get back up? They urinate and defecate, for sure. So over time, what happens in a big continuous boundary is that we move nutrients from out here to here, and we concentrate those nutrients in areas where animals congregate, at shade and water primarily. So the question is how can we better manage these nutrient flows in this pasture? And this is kind of where rotational stocking comes in. So rotation pasture is not only good for the plant, but also good for nutrient distribution within grazing systems. The smaller we make those paddocks and the more frequently we move those animals, the more uniform nutrient distribution we're going to get within the grazing system. And water is an extremely important part of this. And you can work with, there's some great resources at the Soil and Water Conservation District level, which is different in West Virginia. What do we call it in West Virginia?
Conservation district.
Conservation, okay. Yeah. So we can add water to this system so that they don't have to go back to that pond for water. And when we do this, we're going to get a much more uniform distribution of manure over all areas of this pasture. And that's one of the things about rotational stocking we don't talk enough about. Managing flows as we move forward in this nutrient distribution within pastures is going to be more and more important as nutrient prices increase. This is actually some grid sampling. We've got a co-op in the south side of Virginia who has been grid sampling pastures and looking at variable rate application of fertilizer and doing this on some farms. And looking at some of these grid maps they've created, for example, if we look here, this is low, and then this is higher as you get towards the green. So let's look, for example, here for the potassium. What do you think's going on here where we've got this green splotch at? Probably feeding a hay bale there. Where do people like to feed hay bales at?
Nearest to the barn, or nearest to the house.
That's right, where it's convenient to get to, right? In a lot of times, you know, when we feed a pasture, we'll kind of open that gate up and go in there and drop it off and get out of that pasture as quick as we can. And when we do that, we'll tend to get concentrations of nutrients in those hay feeding areas. And we're going to talk more about the hay feeding as we move forward here. This is some work that was done at the University of Missouri, and it's the impact of subdivisions on the manure distribution within pastures. And I kind of feel sorry for the graduate student that had to do this work. But they counted piles of dung. And this is a 3 pasture rotation, and this is the distribution. The distribution was much better when they moved to a 24 pasture rotation. So subdividing those pastures and moving those animals more frequently gave you a much more uniform distribution of dung piles within that pasture area. I just want to mention, you know, in the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about mob grazing or ultra-high stocking density or whatever you want to call it. It's really more rotational stocking. It's much more intensive, but it's really still a form of rotational stocking. And it's where we put a lot of stock density for a very short period of time and have very frequent moves followed by long rest periods. No good definition, but that's kind of the definition I came up with, and maybe you all could add another definition if you want to it. There's a lot of perceived benefits, and I write perceived here because not all of these have been proven in the scientific literature. And just because it's not proven in the scientific literature doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. It just means that we don't know for sure yet. We haven't tested it with the scientific method. And there are some work going on now looking at ultra-high stocking density. But things like increased plant litter, that kind of makes sense because those animals are maybe grazing about 40 or 50% of what's there and leaving a lot of litter on top of the soil surface. Water conservation, increased water infiltration, maybe reduced evaporation. I can see that because we have a lot of litter on top of that surface to keep that moisture from drought tolerance in the grazing system. Well, if we have better moisture, maybe we have some improved drought tolerance. I think one of the biggest benefits in terms of managing drought with this ultra-high stocking density is that we always have standing forage in front of this. It may not be the best forage quality, but we've got something standing in front of us. And that has value within the system. Uniform dung and urine deposition, man, when you bunch a lot of cows up like that in one place, you're going to get some uniform deposition. Enhances soil microbial community. We don't have any real data on that, but I think that makes sense if we're providing lots of plant litter and residue on that soil surface, and those parts of the soil microbial community are breaking that litter down. We're providing them a feed source. Improved nutrient cycling, I can see that because we're getting that much better uniform distribution of dung and urine. Increased species diversity, I don't know, maybe. How about animal performance? Is it lower? I don't know. I haven't seen a lot of good data on this. Maybe it's okay if we're not forcing animals to eat everything that's there. We're letting them make some natural selection in their diet. So they're selecting probably the highest portion of that forage stand, even though it's over mature. They're picking out the best part of it. I think it could fit well with brood cows. I'm not so sure about stockers and replacement heifers in these high-producing animals out there. In the requirement and the nutrient density of understanding forage material, especially later in the season. In the end, I think the jury's still out. There's not a lot of good data yet, and hopefully we're going to gather some in the next several years. All right, I want to change gears just a little bit and talk about, and this is something that slips past producers, sometimes. And one of the points that I make today is when we start,
We'd like to avoid if we could. Sometimes we have to.
we're removing 50 of nitrogen.
I'd like to avoid those and say
1 pounds of K2O per ton of hay.
the animal
Hay.
using from phase 1 forage. The quality is there. What about the
Your-
price? They're not getting enzyme matter.
And 180 pounds of potash. That's a tremendous nutrient removal. If we don't replace these nutrients in our haying systems, then we're going to draw our soil fertility down fairly quickly. It won't happen overnight, but it'll happen over a number of years. So let's look at the value of those nutrients in hay. If we assume 1 ton of hay contains 45 pounds, so what could we do differently? 55 pounds of potash. And we assume these values, 70% nitrogen, 73% phosphorus, and 53% potassium. Every ton of hay has about $72 worth of nutrients.
That's animal. Move them to. Well, what? Where are we going to move them to? What if
Let me ask you, what can you buy hay for? You don't have to be shy. Tell me what you can buy hay for. I forgot to put this slide in, but before I came up, I looked on our VDAX hay clearinghouse, which is the Virginia Department of Agriculture.
I've had a number of students in my class who want to do the farming. I have no idea.
$75 for a ton of hay to buy it.
That's why I put
It's got in it. That poor
Might get-
barely covering the
in rancher price
considering the machinery costs and moving and hauling that hay around.
in those plants.
One of the points I want to make is if you're not a big producer, then there may be some real opportunities for you to purchase hay. And when you purchase that hay and bring that hay into your grazing system, you're not only getting a feed for your animal, but you're also getting $70 worth of nutrients coming into your system. This is not like applying a bag of fertilizer to your pasture.
Fertile, well-watered soil.
Over time, you'll build fertility up in that paddock. So let's talk a little bit about hay feeding and nutrient distribution. We can use hay feeding to move nutrients within and from outside of our farm. And what I mean by within, say I have an
And so we don't really know what's going on. We tend to ignore it, but it's a lot more important than...
on a dairy farm.
Now,
Haul it to the farthest field on the farm? Not usually. I mean, ideally you would, but a lot of times it gets concentrated in areas that are pretty convenient to where the animals are. So we can have areas that are very high in fertility close to the buffer, and then our furthest fields away that can be pretty low in fertility. Over time, if we made hay in those areas of high fertility, we can take that hay and feed it in those areas of low fertility and transfer nutrients around within the farm. And the same thing from outside. If we purchase hay and feed on our worst paddocks, we're moving fertility into the grazing system over time. We always want to kind of target our worst pastures for hay feeding. So if we have pastures that are really low in soil fertility, that's a great place to feed hay because we're going to bring that organic matter and those nutrients into that grazing system.
What we want.
One of the most important points, and I talked with someone this morning that his dad always wants to feed hay in the same place. You know, move those hay feeding points around and get those nutrients in that hay over that tissue. And you can use things like a bale wagon or feeding rings, but I like to roll hay out. And when you roll it out, you can get a better distribution of those nutrients over the lot of plant energy. And we've got, but the main point is move those feeding points around. Don't always feed in the same place. Take a little extra time, take it out in the pasture. Don't just drop the hay bale by the gate and move on. Talk a little bit about organic fertilizer sources, and I don't mean like organic vegetable production. I mean carbon-based fertilizer sources. They include things like broiler litter, biosolids, and pelleted biosolids. I'm not sure what you have access to in the area of your farm, but these are 3 sources that we can get in the south side of Virginia. And what's important to remember about these organic sources is that not all the nitrogen in those are plant available. You know, depending on the source, 30 to 60% of that nitrogen will be available to that plant. And additional nitrogen is slowly mineralized and released over subsequent years. Nutrients vary with the source. Phosphorus can build up over time. What's important to remember is that nitrogen and phosphorus are about a 1-to-1 ratio in these organic sources. A plant needs about a 3-to-1 ratio. So if you're applying these organic sources to meet the nitrogen requirement of your pasture plants or your hayfield, then you're applying about 3 times as much phosphorus as the plants need. And over time, that phosphorus is going to build up, and you have to keep an eye on that. They can be a really good buy if you'd call that a leaf area index of 1. You've got to sit down and do the 1 unit. Make sure that what if I add sources is actually tapping out and is an economical buy. Birds. Let's just look at broiler real quick. So we've got about 40 in the south side. We'll have about 40 pounds of plant available nitrogen per ton of broiler litter. 50 pounds of phosphate and about 50 pounds of potash. And it costs $35 a ton to spread, generally speaking. Okay. It does. In our area, that's what it costs. The further you go away from our area, of course, the trucking is going to cost more. And sometimes you can get a good deal on the trucking if you treat it for quantities, leaf area units, or litter. And of course, transporting long distances, anything like this, it becomes an issue. I don't know what we have in West Virginia, but in Virginia we have a cost share program to move broiler litter out of certain counties and square inches of that very high area of phosphorus to soil. And it can be a graph of up to $15 a ton to move it outside of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Biosolids are another organic fertilizer source that we could possibly use. And this is a very emotional issue for a lot of people. But maximum rate, and I kind of want to maintain them in a pretty good fertilizer source, especially if you need phosphorus. If they come in different ways, digested, composted, and lime stabilized are 3 different types. In the analysis of some biosolids that we've used at the research station to bring some new land into production was about a 4% nitrogen, 5% phosphorus, and almost no potassium in the biosolids. It gets washed out during the processing. And about 30% of that nitrogen is available. And we used a lime stabilized biosolid. It had about 415 pounds of ag lime per ton of biosolid, dry ton of biosolid. And you have to have a permit in Virginia, and I suspect it's the same in West Virginia to apply land apply biosolids. In Virginia at this time, there's no cost to the landowner, so they're a pretty good deal, especially if you need that phosphorus. And then we have some cities in Virginia and North Carolina, close to the south side, that are actually pelletizing biosolids, and you can apply this. This is a Class A fertilizer product, no permit needed, and you apply it just like you would a granular fertilizer product. It's a little bit more dusty than most fertilizer products. It costs, it has a 666 and 30% of the nitrogen's available. It costs about $55 a ton spread. And the biggest factor is limited availability on this. Sometimes you can get it, sometimes you can't get it. It just depends on the time of the year and whether the person supplying it has the contract from that plant. So let's look at the important part of these organic nitrogen sources. That's the cost of the nitrogen. So if I have pelleted biosolids and it costs me $55 a ton spread to get 40 pounds of plant available nitrogen per ton, it's going to cost me about $1.37 per pound of plant available nitrogen. Good deal or bad deal? Good. Anybody want to pay $1.37 for a pound of nitrogen? No, not really. Broiler litter, 88 cents per pound of nitrogen. And then we look at the current cost of urea, 70 cents a pound. The point I want to make with this slide is that if you're applying these organic sources for the nitrogen, sometimes, and you don't,
Species and the season and the weather conditions.
sometimes it's not as good of a deal as we often think it is. So let's look at nutrients, and that really changes the picture. If we look at the cost of pellet
in July and August,
the phosphorus and the little bit of potassium that's in it and the nitrogen, then down to 29 cents per pound of nutrient. In this calculation says I need the phosphorus, and that's a pretty good deal. Same thing with the broiler litter. When we include the potassium, phosphorus, and the nitrogen calculation, we're at 21 units per pound of nutrient. That's a good deal in today's fertilizer market. But you've got to sit down
any of our cool seed
and figure out what I need, what I don't need, and then how much it's going to cost me per pound. You certainly would. The question was, well, would you gain some other things other than just these nutrients? And you certainly would. You would gain some nutrients.
Find out is pasture growth rate has been very high. They've been in phase 2.
I'm not sure how to value that organic matter within these calculations, but certainly it has some value. And then I just wanted to compare it to 68 cents per pound of nutrient. All right. I want to talk a little bit more about legumes and kind of rethinking legumes. Normally when we talk about using improved legumes and pastures, we think about things like white clover and red clover and maybe even alfalfa in some cases. And add those
on this
requirements of those legumes, and we've done that. And with the advent of readily available fertilizer and lime, we've been able to do that in the past. Sometimes we may have a farm that we're renting on a short-term lease that we just can't justify putting a lot of soil fertility into because we may not have it next year. And this is kind of where this rethinking legumes comes in. So why not change the legume to match the soil? And we do have a few legumes that tolerate lower levels of fertility. And maybe including those into grazing systems may be an approach for this land that's lower in fertility and we can't justify adding a lot of fertility to. The first one is annual Lespedeza that I just wanted to mention. Annual Lespedeza was used widely 50 or 60 years ago. Before we had a lot of access to lime and fertilizer, we used annual Lespedeza in grazing and haying systems. And we've kind of forgotten about it. It tends to be lower in productivity than our more traditional legumes that we use, like white and red clover and green clover. But it is tolerant to lower levels of fertility. It yields 1 to 2 tons. We have 2 types, and I generally like to tell people to use the Korean if they can get it. More dependable reseeding, a little bit higher in yield, and we can frost seed it, and at about 10 to 15 acres, 10 to 15 pounds per acre. It's not as productive as some of these new improved legumes, but if we have a farm where we can't afford to adjust the fertility to meet the requirements of the new legumes, maybe this is an option for that farm to overseed that farm with.
Enough.
Sericea Lespedeza, I may get thrown out of the state of West Virginia for talking about Sericea, but it can be a part of a grazing system. We find this commonly
Is going to maybe
the worst ground that we have in
because
road cuts, reclaimed mine,
this guy, okay, fiber,
very,
ability,
it's very low in fertility.
quantity is tremendous.
We find Sericea Lespedeza on. So when I was doing my dissertation project in Kentucky, I worked on reclaimed mine land, and that reclaimed mine land was dominated by tall fescue and Sericea Lespedeza. Formed well. All 3 years of the study, they were
Up at
2.2 cells a day.
myself, what's that going to cost me to do that? Like
Buddy. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to have Sericea. It's a long-lived perennial. It's a warm season. It's non-bloating, well adapted to Georgia and South Carolina and Virginia, West Virginia.
in too much time.
Extremely drought tolerant, which is a big plus for us, and very tolerant of poor fertility in acidic soils. There's really only one commercially available variety of Sericea Lespedeza, and that's AU Grazer. It was developed at Auburn University. It's medium in tannin levels. It was selected under grazing pressure for grazing tolerance, and it was selected for fine cattle. And you can get that from Sims Brothers Seeds. The other varieties, and has been in recent history other varieties of Sericea Lespedeza, but you can't
Reincorporate.
commercially. But at one time I wanted to put in a Sericea Lespedeza trial, so I called, we have like a seed bank where you can get, that conserves seeds, and I called and I said I'd get some AU low tan seed for my trial. And they're like, okay, we can send you 12 seeds. I said, exactly what I was looking for. So they conserve that seed, but in low quantities. Now, you can still buy reclamation type seed in this variety. Okay, so Sericea Lespedeza, but I wouldn't recommend that for grazing systems. If you want to try to graze it, go with AU low grazer, or AU grazer. And it does have to be stocked rotationally, and the biggest challenge to using Sericea is poor seedling vigor. It takes a while to get going, but once you get it going, it's a pretty vigorous plant. All right, so let's finish up and just talk a little bit about optimizing soil fertility in grazing systems. I think that soil testing is absolutely critical. You know,
Gain per day,
really,
kilograms, but we'll turn it into pounds, so that'd be 2.2 pounds average daily gain, or gain per acre in kilograms per hectare, but that's more or less the same as pounds per acre. So we might be up at 800, 900
blended fertilizers and apply what the soil test calls for, and not 1 pound more nutrient. Not just from an economical standpoint, but also from an environmental standpoint. We don't
Most can
up
perform
extremely high levels of
genetic potential, which is
You want to lime pastures. If there's a thing you can do that's going to give you the payback, if you need lime, apply that lime according to your soil test. Please remember, don't apply lime blindly. You know, you can do damage with too much lime too. If we get our pH too high,
okay.
limit it
In that function.
on the other side of the scale. Usually that's not a problem, but apply lime according to the soil test. Rotationally stocked pastures. Gets back to this idea of management. We're not only managing the livestock, and we're not only managing the plant in that pasture, but we're also managing these nutrient cycles within that pasture as we move forward. This management input is going to be much more important as we move forward in terms of building and maintaining soil fertility in grazing systems. We need to really take a hard look at how we're managing legumes in grazing systems. We need to actively manage for legumes and grazing systems. Just don't take what comes, but think about how we can create an environment through our grazing management and through our soil fertility that legumes are going to thrive in. Our pastures. They're more and more important every day in our pastures. Especially as that nitrogen cost continues to be high. think about buying and feeding hay if it makes sense for you. You know, if you're a producer of 40 cows,
And it does. The place where you make the most money is some area in between these two things, and it's hard to
time to make if you're honest with yourself.
the most money
Budget,
maximizing gain per acre. Counterintuitive,
so look at machinery costs. So you need a little bit of value on your labor. It's going to be over $100 a ton for sure. In many cases, we can
per acre
buy
does to
the feed for less than $75. And we get those nutrients coming into our grazing system. Use organic fertilizer cycles when they make sense. Go through the calculation. Make sure that you put the pencil to the paper and that they're going to be a profitable part of your fertility management system. Sometimes they're not if you don't need that extra phosphorus in them. And then consider alternative legumes. So if you're in a position with running a farm and you don't have
a way to allocate forage to animals
a lot of ability to put high inputs of fertility into that farm,
through a series.
spreading a little bit of annual Lespedeza can help bring some nitrogen into that grazing system on that farm. Go ahead. It usually is pretty reasonable, but there's a shortage because of the drought. And
Allocate off some of this that we're going to harvest mechanically for hay or silage. And that kind of order pasture in balance with the animal numbers, because we know the pasture plants were growing rapidly. We kind of fixed that.
the calculation of if we put out, 1 to 2 pounds of white clover and 4 to 6 pounds of red clover and 10 pounds of annual Lespedeza, it was about $25 to $30 when I did that calculation. But that was before the annual Lespedeza price went up. All right, I'll leave you with a parting thought, and that's that to bring about a measurable change in the grazing system, it takes 3 to 5 years. In today's society,
Growing seasons. Strip grazing is something we tend to do on dormant forage, like fall stockpiled, winter grazed forage.
my wife calls me, she doesn't want to get an answering machine, she wants to talk to me now. And we've kind of lost patience. And to make real change in the grazing system due to management, it takes 3 to 5 years. So I challenge you to go ahead and figure out where, set some goals, make your changes, and then remember that good things come to people who are patient.
We manage to be
Happy to answer any questions.
take of the mother.
And
Don't need as much.
listen to me, I was afraid I was going to be talking to myself as one of the last speakers in the conference. Is there any questions? Yes, sir?
On your annual Lespedeza, are you using that just strictly as an annual, or do you want it to be a reseeding annual, or what? Because when I've driven across the past, I know it's just a blue thing before fall.
I think it's probably going to be used primarily as an annual. It can reseed in some conditions, but I'm not sure exactly how consistent the reseeding is. Maybe Gary's got an idea.
For me, it's variable. I can't
Yeah.
always count it.
Yeah. So that may be an annual or a biennial input into the system. Is there any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for staying.